יתגלה מהר סיני, דינך אמת ואמיתה, הוד ויקר היא מלכותך, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל. עלהו בו עמנואל, ופדה משבי ישראל, שמתייפח בגלותו, עד בן האל בא לפדותו, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל.
Welcome to The Voice of Jacob. I'm Gideon Lazar.
And I'm Yarden Zelivansky.
And welcome to our new podcast. We thought a good first discussion would be to discuss the feast of the circumcision of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Right. If you think about it, it's a feast that's it's kind of perfect for us because it's obviously fundamentally a Christian feast, talking about the life of Christ, but Christ's first act of obedience being obedience to the law. It's also a fundamentally Jewish feast. So it really brings both of these traditions together. And as we delve deeper into it, I think it'll really shine how Judaism, or the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, are much closer together than people tend to think.
Yeah, I think so. It's very interesting that, and we have the birth of Christ, and then 8 days later, so preserving that actual time, we then have the circumcision of Christ. And then 40 days later, we have the presentation in the temple. And so really this whole liturgical season preserves these important feast days and the lengths of feast days and so on.
Right. And I mean, here we call it Jewish, and I think it is fundamentally Jewish in many important ways, but it also shines a spotlight on how the New Testament doesn't do away with the Old Testament, and how the writings of the Old Testament and the context that the Old Testament provides the New Testament texts is a very important part of the Christian tradition that we can't just ignore, and we have to understand it in order to understand the writings of the New Testament.
Yeah, I think that's very true, because in order, we have this traditional feast here of the circumcision, in order to understand the full theological weight of it, which involves understanding the purpose of why Jesus came, we have to then look at the Old Testament to understand what was the whole point of the institution of circumcision in the first place.
Right.
Yeah. And this feast is a traditional feast in both the East and the West. But nowadays, after the reforms in the New Mass, they changed the name of the feast to the Solemnity of Mary in the West. But if you actually look at the readings, it still mentions the circumcision. And in the West, for a long time, Mary was commemorated actually on the same day as the Feast of the Circumcision. There's a good discussion about the history of this feast in both the East and the West in Dom Prosper Guéranger, sort of this great liturgical scholar in the late 19th century, who went through all the feasts of the Roman calendar. Of course, in the Old Mass, that was what it was at the time. And it was interesting to see that actually it's not that the New Mass got rid of circumcision, the Feast of the Circumcision per se, but the emphasis, I think, shifted from the Feast of the Circumcision to the Solemnity of Mary, even though both these feasts are traditional there in the West on this day.
Right. And I personally think it's a shame that they've moved away from the circumcision a little bit. I realize why maybe some people think it's irrelevant, and I'm not saying the Feast of Mary, the Mother of God, isn't important, of course, but I think it's very beneficial to really ponder Christ being circumcised. There are a lot of writings about why he was circumcised and what that tells us, but I think today, with kind of the rising wave of anti-Semitism in the church, we see a lot of people calling the act of circumcision barbaric, or trying to kind of reframe the history of circumcision within the people of God. So I think it's really important to kind of pause and think that Christ voluntarily, his first act of obedience was to perform this ritual of circumcision, and what that means for us today, whether or not we come from a Jewish background as Catholics.
Yeah, I think that's very true because if you look at the Christian tradition, there was, and we'll get into this later in the podcast, a sort of strong discouragement of the Christian practice of circumcision. But it was not because of sort of what you sometimes see from modern people of, oh, this is barbaric or it's harmful and stuff. St. John of Damascus actually discusses how God told Abraham to cut away this useless piece of flesh. That in the eyes of the church fathers, this is actually not harmful.
Right.
As an act. And so there's a discouragement of it for theological reasons, as we'll get into later, but it was not because circumcision was looked at in itself as a negative thing.
That's interesting. I actually didn't know that quote, and it mirrors very interestingly some rabbinic writings that you see saying that circumcision perfects the creation of God. So calling it a useless piece of flesh that Abraham needs to remove, it's not quite the same thing, but it kind of corresponds to that. Or with that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting to look at the reading for this feast in the Byzantine Rite. The epistle reading is Colossians 2, 8-12. In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by the putting off of the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. And so there's this idea here that in baptism, we are incorporated into Christ. And so even Gentile Christians are in a sense circumcised, but their circumcision is Christ's circumcision as they are incorporated into him. There's a really great discussion of this in the Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas by Matthew Levering. His book, Christ's Fulfillment of Torah and Temple, Salvation According to Thomas Aquinas. And in the first chapter, he's dealing with the objection that Christians ought to keep the Old Testament law. Basically explains that according to St. Thomas Aquinas, the ceremonial law of the Old Covenant is meant to point to the work that Christ fulfilled, and so Christ actually keeps the reality of the law within himself. And so through being incorporated into him, we are actually keeping the law, but we're keeping the law in a different mode. Even Gentile Christians are here actually in a sense keeping the law, but they're keeping it through their participation in Christ's fulfillment of it.
Right, that echoes Paul's writing in Galatians, where he said that anybody circumcised is therefore obliged by the entire law. So Christ taking upon himself circumcision kind of takes the entirety of the law upon himself, obviously fulfilling it in a perfect way that no human could. Which again, I think kind of a lot of the tones you hear today saying that Christ wasn't a faithful Jew or that Christ wasn't obedient to the Torah or to the law in some way. His very first act refutes that, taking upon himself the entire law. And then, of course, taking upon himself the burden of the law or the punishment of the law so that none of us, Jew or Gentile, will have to be under that obligation anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into a little bit now what St. Thomas Aquinas writes on this, because I think it's very interesting to look at. I mean, this is sort of the highest theological authority after the magisterium within the Catholic tradition. And so I think it's important to look at how he discusses circumcision, because it'll actually surprise you, I think, because a lot of people sort of have this vision. I think even people who want to improve the relationship between, say, Jews and the church will say, oh, the church was always anti-Semitic in the past, and now maybe it's overcoming it. Or people who say, oh, no, back in the good old days, we were anti-Semitic, and we need to get back to that. But I think if you actually look at the Catholic tradition, things are a lot more nuanced than people make it out to be. So Aquinas discusses circumcision in the Tertia Pars of the Summa. So for those who don't know, this is the Summa Theologiae, is sort of this big textbook on theology St. Thomas Aquinas writes. And he breaks it up into 3 parts. And the first part is on God, both in himself and as creator. The second part is on humans. And then the third part is on the incarnation. So bringing together the perfection of God and man in a single being. And in it, he first discusses Christ as in himself as a person, and then Christ as he communicates himself to us in the sacraments. And so he discusses circumcision in 2 places here. He first discusses it when he's discussing the life of Christ and how Christ practices circumcision. But I think it's actually important to first look actually at the second mention of circumcision, which is when he's discussing the sacraments. Because he discusses how circumcision is actually, he says, a sacrament of the old law. By the old law here, he means in Jewish terms, the Torah. Because circumcision, a sacrament in St. Thomas Aquinas' theology, has sort of three steps to it. There's first what he calls the sacrament itself, which is, so in baptism, we have the actual water of baptism and the actual act of baptizing. And that's the sacrament itself. Then he says the sacrament and the reality together. Because the sacraments are meant to symbolize something. And so baptism symbolizes someone's incorporation into Christ and into the church. But you first have the sacrament and the reality together, where when someone is baptized, they are now have what we say the baptismal character of them, that now their soul is a baptized soul and there's nothing that can be done to undo that. So sort of this middle step. And then the last step is the reality itself, which is grace coming into our soul and actually incorporating us into Christ fully. And that last step is this middle step, because let's say someone's baptized, but they don't really believe in it, or they're not really intending to unite themselves to Christ. Well, then they wouldn't actually receive the grace, but they still receive the baptismal character. And likewise in circumcision, it has this middle step of, there's an actual act of cutting away of the flesh, that they are now a member then of the people of Israel. But St. Thomas Aquinas will discuss how actually there is still a communication of grace going on in baptism, even in the Old Covenant, not in itself. So in baptism, grace actually sort of flows through the baptismal waters into the person being baptized. And that was not the case with the Old Covenant. But when their circumcision happens, right, it is pointed forward to what Christ is going to do. And so when the parents circumcised their child, they were looking forward to the work that Christ would ultimately do. And so they receive grace on account of the work that Christ would do. And so there's, again, the actual act of circumcision, then this middle step of being circumcised, and then the final step of actually receiving grace on account of the work that Christ would do in the future.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think for a lot of people, probably myself included, before I start reading about these topics, it's sometimes surprising today. Not sure if it's completely accurate to say it this way, but just for convenience sake, it seems like Christianity can be sometimes kind of too focused on the New Testament in a way that's a little bit divorced from the Old Testament. And it's really interesting to see this massive thinker that's such a pillar of the Catholic tradition delves so deeply into not just the historical reality, but the spiritual and metaphysical reality behind the act of circumcision that's so distinctly Jewish. It really is fascinating.
Yeah, I think so, because in medieval Christianity, if you walked into a church east or west, you're going to see lots of art of Old Testament figures as well, that they really deeply absorbed themselves into the Old Testament, in a sense understood it even as their own history as they were being incorporated in. There's a great work called The History of the Franks by St. Gregory of Tours, where he's writing about the history of the Frankish people. But he actually starts with the whole first book recounts the whole history of the Old Testament. And he goes all the way back to creation, goes through that. Because in order to understand in his mind where the French people fit into world history, you have to figure out how they fit into the biblical story, which is primarily about Israel. And then as the nations are then grafted into Israel. And so I think this is something that oftentimes modern Christianity has sometimes lost. And I think this is actually a resource of our tradition in going back and really retrieving the Old Testament roots of Christianity.
Right. As an Israeli Jew, that aspect of the Old Testament being my personal history, my family history, kind of goes without saying, because you read about the tribe of Levi, I'm from the tribe of Levi, you just know, right? And you read about all the places and it's right where you live, so you know it's your history. But then when sometimes I listen to recordings of the Bible or sermons or stuff like that in English, and I hear them butchering Hebrew names, except for Father Mike Schmitz, who does a wonderful job pronouncing all the Hebrew names in his podcast. Sometimes it hits me how foreign all of this must feel to anybody who does not speak Hebrew or maybe a similar language. So I can see why it's a lot easier to read the New Testament, where all the names are already translated into things like Mark and John and James that everybody is used to saying, and kind of find yourself a lot more in that. But it's not just the people of Israel who don't make sense without the Bible. Every nation on earth doesn't make sense without the Bible. So for us, it's more biologically and historically, and for everybody else, it's more spiritually. But it's still an integral part of every nation's history. And it really shouldn't be glossed over just because it feels a little bit foreign.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that different people are coming from different backgrounds. There'll be different things that lead them to the faith. So you hear a lot of people who are philosophers who convert. It was studying metaphysics or ethics or something, and then they see how the Catholic Church sort of has the perfect version of this philosophy, and so that's what leads them ultimately to the Catholic Church. Right. And we sort of see philosophy as this preparation for Christ among the Gentiles. I think for those of us coming from a Jewish background, we grew up with these stories. Like I remember in 3rd grade putting on a play about the sacrifice of Isaac, because we had spent the whole year learning about the lives of the patriarchs. And for us, this is, right. Hey, this is the beginning of the history of our people, just like an American would learn, like, hey, this is the Revolutionary War, this is the beginning of the American people, or a French person might learn about, like, the history of the French kings and so on. For Jews, like, we read the Old Testament as this is, like, our history of our people. And then to see, once you become Catholic, you then see how sort of like the veil falls over your eyes and you see all these stories that you've been sort of living in as your own tradition actually also have all these theological meanings that point to the Gentile religion that you sort of thought was like this weird heretical offshoot of your old religion, you know?
Right, right. And I think it's worth mentioning that, well, there are mixed opinions about this. You can't really speak for Judaism or for Jewish people in any unified, coherent way. But I think for a lot of people, I've met a lot of people personally who didn't know that Christians believe in the Old Testament at all. They thought all of the Christian holy writings are just the books of the New Testament. So I think a lot of Jewish people, especially in Israel, where you don't really come in friction with a lot of Christians very often, depending on where you live, I tend to think most people wouldn't really view it as cultural appropriation, so to speak. But I think people often think about how to help, people of a Jewish background come to Christ and how to make Christianity more appealing. And being very literate in the Old Testament and knowing how to connect the Catholic Church and the modern Christian faith very, very tightly to the Old Testament is a great way to do that. Being ignorant about the Old Testament, being ignorant about the history of the nation of Israel is probably the best way to make Jews feel distanced from it.
Mm-hmm. I know after St. Edith Stein converted, she would often go back with her mother to synagogue, and she would pray her breviary while she was in the synagogue. She started pointing out to her mother all the psalms that were both in the Siddur, the Hebrew prayer book, and were in her breviary there, just translated to Latin. And her mother was shocked that, like, these Catholic monks were praying all these Jewish prayers. And I've even had this at times where I was not raised all that religious, but we would go to synagogue occasionally, we'd celebrate the major holidays. So I knew all these Jewish prayers, but I never really learned what they meant. I would often just learn the Hebrew, so I knew, like, the right steps to take in synagogue. And then I became a Christian in high school, and I started learning traditional Christian prayers and so on. I started praying the Psalms very frequently, thinking, oh, these are some cool Old Testament prayers, but not knowing that they were actually often the same prayers that I had learned. Like, for example, the Ashrei is a psalm, Psalm 145, that I had to memorize for my bar mitzvah, and not realizing for years that that was a psalm that I would pray in my regular daily prayers, and I had learned in Hebrew beforehand. Or the Kadosh, 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 being the same as our Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus. And seeing sort of this shock of that actually Christian and Jewish liturgical life have all these overlaps because they're drawing from the same sources, very often without either side realizing all of the connections. Or another one I just discovered recently is in the Amidah, which is this Jewish prayer prayed 3 times a day. There's a thing that's mentioned of to raise our banner to gather our exiles from among the nations. And I was going through Sacrosanctum Concilium recently, which is a document from Vatican II on the liturgy, and it refers to the church as the banner raised among the nations. And I went and I checked the footnote for it, which is Isaiah 11:12, and the full quote there in Isaiah is that the Messiah is going to be this banner raised among the nations, and he will gather the tribes of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And so you have here this interesting passage, which is taken up in both the Jewish and Christian traditions, sort of in these different ways, but in ways that I actually think are very mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never heard about that story about Edith Stein, but it reminded me of another one that when her mom died, she asked that her siddur be brought to the Carmel where she was living. And then she said that in it, she found her own Catholic faith. And it's really a living example about how the New Testament is hidden in the Old, and the Old Testament is revealed in the New, kind of made flesh in the religion of the Old Testament and the religion of the New Testament, which of course one has a significant amount more providence in its development than the other. But still, you can kind of see in the living embodiment of the religions that develop from these books, how that's still true, how there's still this correspondence, this give and take, even though there were a lot of attempts on both sides to kind of distance themselves from each other. And I have to say my experience was a lot like yours. The first time I attended Mass, I was, I think, 17. And I remember just being in awe at all of the bits of prayer that the Mass was in English, but I could just repeat them in my head in Hebrew because it was just taken out of the Jewish prayer life. Some of it because it's out of Psalms of the Bible, and some of it because it's just very similar to Jewish prayers. Yeah, it was quite astounding.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention here, going back to circumcision then, sort of 2 points that when St. Thomas Aquinas is discussing it that I think are really interesting. And this is in the Tertia Pars, the third part of the Summa, in question 70. It's very interesting when he asks here in Article 2 whether circumcision was instituted in a fitting manner. On the contrary, he just says, on the contrary, we read Genesis 17, that circumcision was instituted by God, whose works are perfect. And so he just assumes that, this is in the Old Testament. The Old Testament says that God instituted it. Therefore, it must be perfect. And then he likewise asks whether the rite of circumcision is fitting. He mentions here, on the contrary, the aforementioned rite of circumcision is fixed by a gloss in Romans 4:11, and he received the sign of circumcision. I answer that, as stated above, circumcision was established by God as a sign of faith, by God of whose wisdom there is no number. Now, to determine suitable signs is a work of wisdom. Consequently, it must be that the rite of circumcision was fitting. And then he goes in and he starts looking at all these sort of symbolic things, and he's often doing this just from drawing from the scripture, because he's not in close contact with Jews. And he mentions here, interestingly, I actually don't know if this is still a Jewish tradition, but in the Old Testament, there's a number of cases of circumcision being done with a stone knife. This is in Exodus 4:25 and Joshua 5:2. And then he quotes 1 Corinthians 10:4 of the rock was Christ. And so he sees here in this use of a stone knife for circumcision, Christ as the one who is actually circumcising them.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. It really corresponds to Christ being the one who baptizes us as well. Mm-hmm. How circumcision foreshadows baptism, and then it's Christ who circumcised them, and likewise it's Christ who baptizes us. Really ties together how it's not, the old people of the covenant break the new people of the covenant, but it's just one history of the church. Mm-hmm. And the concepts just flow throughout these past, 3,500 years, even if they look a little bit different at times.
Yeah, because all the saints of the old covenant, they were actually all united to Christ by placing their hope in him to come in the future. And so we actually speak of them as members of the church. And actually, the word church is an Old Testament word that appears. It's translated differently in most of our Bibles. But if you look into the Greek Bible, it will be ecclesia all the way through in the Old and New Testament.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, it's not as common in the West today, but in the Eastern traditions, you definitely think of them as, Saint Moses or Saint David the King. Mm-hmm. I really like that. It's kind of unashamedly taking these people and adopting them into the Christian tradition, because they were Christians in every meaningful sense, even if they didn't have the fullness of knowledge that we do today about who Christ is, when he's going to come, what he's going to do. I do think, and Thomas talks about this as well, that a few figures from the Old Testament did specifically know of Jesus, but even those who didn't, everybody who died faithful in the Old Testament died faithful to Christ, whether or not they knew it.
Yeah. It's interesting also he mentions the reason for circumcision in specific, of why is it this specific act. Thomas gives 3 interesting reasons, and this is in the reply to the first objection of Article 3 here. He notes sort of 3 reasons why this had to be the specific act that was done. And he said, first of all, this is a sign of faith that Christ would be born of Abraham's seed, and so it has to do with the reproductive member. Secondly, one of the things circumcision actually did, even in the Old Testament, was remove original sin. And since there's this idea, this is debated in the tradition, but St. Thomas Aquinas holds the view that at least in part original sin was passed down through reproduction. And so he says this actually sort of is a sign that this is going to be the removal of original sin. And then the third point is that sort of by removing a part of the sexual organs was to help place those sexual desire under proper control. A lot of Jews misunderstand Catholic beliefs about sexuality because Judaism doesn't sort of lost a tradition of celibacy. We know of Jews who sort of lived in monasteries and were celibate at the time of Christ. But this was not practiced among the Pharisees, and so this was lost among Judaism when the Pharisees sort of became the main sect that won out. But it's not our view that sexual reproduction is bad or anything, but that it won't be done in the eschaton. And so, as a result, then, people who take on the religious life are sort of living already like they're living in the eschaton. And so they sacrifice this in order to have, ultimately to point to the reality, which is that as we see in things like the Song of Solomon, right, that ultimately the purpose of marriage is to point to the union of God and his people. And this is understood in both the Jewish and Christian traditions.
Right.
And so this has to be placed under proper control and properly ordered. But we see in marriage, sexuality is actually a very good thing if it's placed in its proper place. And so that's our view on it, basically. It has to be within its proper place, and we don't see it as a bad thing at all.
Right. I do agree with you that a lot of Jews misconceive the Christian or the Catholic view, the traditional Christian view on sexuality. And I see it going in either one of 2 ways. They just look at the Western world and assume that all of the lawlessness that we see is what Christianity believes. Or much more commonly, they look at priests in the Latin Rite and monks and friars and say, well, Christianity therefore must hate sex. Now, it's worth mentioning that there are writers in the Christian traditions who wrote pretty sternly on sexual desires at all, but it's not the voice that won in the Christian tradition, and it's not the view of the church. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very interesting that Judaism kind of lost this celibate tradition because the idea of submitting your desires to God and properly placing everything under him does exist in Christianity. You know, eating in measure, sex having certain rules and laws of the Torah that you need to abide by. All of these things, the fundamental principles that eventually in Christianity lead to celibacy and to monasteries, that line of thinking does exist in Judaism. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we should turn now to the circumcision of Christ. But St. Thomas Aquinas in as the Tertia Pars question 37, Article 1, actually gives a sort of very good explanation of why Christ had to be circumcised. And he gives 7 reasons for Christ to be circumcised. So the first one he gives here is, quote, in order to prove the reality of his human nature, in contradiction to the Manichaeans who said that he had an imaginary body, and in contradiction to Apollinarius, who said that Christ's body was consubstantial to his Godhead, and in contradiction to Valentine, who said that Christ had brought his body from heaven. First of all, I want to know, it's quite amazing how much church history Thomas Aquinas knew in the 13th century. Yeah. This is impressive that they actually had this good of a record of the history of the church, even at this time.
Yeah, absolutely.
This St. Thomas's time, there was the Cathars, which sort of brought back some Gnostic ideas, but for the most part, Gnosticism was sort of long gone in the church, but he was even gone by the time of Nicaea. There's a lot of people who don't know Christian history. They imagine what Constantine did at Nicaea is, he removed all the Gnostic Gospels that gave us the real Jesus. But Gnosticism was already gone by the late 2nd century.
Right.
But it sort of placed within, or it's late 3rd century, I should say, but it placed within the consciousness of Christians a very important point, which is the goodness of the human body. And a very Jewish idea at that is that we ultimately believe that we're not just awaiting our souls going to heaven, uniting with God, but the resurrection of our physical bodies. And this was something that was very shocking to the ancient Greco-Roman world that Christianity came into. The whole idea in someone like Plato is that the ultimate goal of life is to escape your body. That your body, he specifically refers to it as a prison. And that once we escape our body, then we're able to get to heaven. And we're able to sort of behold goodness itself in heaven there. So something like beholding God is not necessarily alien to it. There's a good talk I was at this summer from D.C. Schindler, a theologian, philosopher. And he made the point that when St. Thomas is talking about beholding God in the beatific vision, even though this can't be achieved through human nature and we need grace, Plato and Aristotle would have understood what St. Thomas Aquinas was talking about there. So for example, Aristotle will talk about how we as humans can only achieve an imperfect happiness. And the gods have this sort of perfect happiness, beholding the supreme God. And so ultimately then Christianity here enables us to achieve what Aristotle thought only the gods could achieve, or what we would call the angels. But what would have shocked Plato and Aristotle is this idea that our bodies are going to be there too, that there's going to be a resurrected body, there's going to be an incarnation, that there's a Trinity. These are the sorts of things that would have been completely unintelligible to Plato and Aristotle. And so Christ, in being circumcised, he proves that this is a physical human body here that's able to have flesh that's cut away. Because a lot of these early heretics, what they would do is say Christ came spiritually. So yes, he walked around, he looked like he was human, but he wasn't really human. And by being physically circumcised, it showed, actually, no, he is fully human.
Just something you said made me think of it, that there's actually another heresy that this is combating, and that's Marcionism. Because Christ's first act is essentially to say to us today, you can't really detach any of these books and traditions from the life of the church. And, the church has reached a certain point a very long time ago that we don't really have new heresies anymore. We have the same old heresies popping up every now and then, maybe dressed up a little differently. And Marcionism, or pseudo-Marcionism, or quasi-Marcionism, or semi-Marcionism, or whatever, is really making a strong comeback. And you can see it on like Twitter and other social media. That's Christ is kind of, sticking a stake here, saying, no, this is a part of Scripture. This is a good thing. And it goes back to what Thomas Aquinas said. God said, this is good. This is good. This was a commandment from God.
He does mention this very briefly, I think, in the next reason, which is, he says, in order to show his approval of circumcision, which God had instituted of old. But he sort of glosses over that relatively quickly, because I think that Marcionism is almost so foreign to medieval Christianity. Like, this is not on St. Thomas Aquinas' radar very much.
Yeah, which makes it interesting, right? Because he actually, you're right, he does talk about it very, very briefly, even though it's really relevant today, and it was really relevant a few centuries before. Quite providential, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it shows how much Christian tradition absorbed the Old Testament into sort of their own life. I mean, St. Thomas, he wrote commentaries on Isaiah, Jeremiah, Job, and he started on the Psaltery, never finished his commentary on the Psalms. And if you read he wrote commentaries on 2 of the Gospels and all of the Pauline epistles. And if you read those, he's constantly quoting the Old Testament to explain what's going on in the Gospels and what St. Paul is talking about in his letters.
Right, and this is a time where they didn't have 3 readings at Mass. They just had, the epistle and the Gospel. So this is him just understanding, and a lot of other Christians and scholars at the time, right? Not just Thomas. But this is St. Thomas just personally understanding the importance of the Old Testament if you want to understand the life of Christ and the life of the church. Even though the church isn't Torah observant as such, you can't really detach these two from one another.
Yeah. The next reason St. Thomas gives here is, quote, in order to prove that he was descended from Abraham, who had received the commandment of circumcision as a sign of faith in him. And so he shows here sort of this is the fulfillment of this long line going all the way back to Abraham.
Right, exactly. I mean, and again, it seems to me like, I don't know, maybe I don't know enough about the context St. Thomas was writing in, but it seems to me like probably not a lot of heretics were questioning the fact at the time. It's also the very first lines of the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
But today, a lot of people do kind of bring into question Jesus' lineage from the Christian side, not so much from the Jewish side anymore. But you have a lot of Christians saying, was he or was he not a Jew, and trying to kind of play with different definitions to make that work. But here, just St. Thomas saying, to prove that he was a son of Abraham, a true son of Abraham, he took upon himself circumcision.
Yeah, then our next reason he gives, this one's interesting. He says, in order to take away from the Jews an excuse for not receiving him if he were uncircumcised. I think this is very important when we speak to Jews, because I remember I saw someone once criticizing me on Twitter saying, oh, he's just talking about all this Jewish stuff and evangelizing Jews because really he just wants to sort of play into what this guy was accusing of Jewish narcissism. He's saying Jews are just obsessed with themselves. And, us Gentiles, we're able to become Christians without being obsessed with our own Gentile identity. So why can't Jews just do it? But the whole point is that if you're Catholic, you believe that God instituted all this stuff. So the fact that Jews are very insistent on all of this stuff is not because they are obsessed with Jews doing it. I get some secular Jews might be like that, but I think very religious Jews are ultimately, it's because God instituted this, and so the Messiah has to keep all this because that's what God said he was going to do. And so St. Thomas is showing here that the Jews can't object that, let's say Christ did come in at his birth, fully instituted the church and removed the old law and everything, and then the Jews could say, well, no, he was actually just a heretic, sort of leaving our religion. But the Jews can't say that now because he actually did keep his own life perfectly obedient to the law.
Right, exactly, which is why I think when that discussion sort of does come up, it gets very, very, they start nitpicking very, very quickly, the people on that side of the discussion, and talk about, them eating wheat on a Saturday and stuff that have really much more to do with rabbinic tradition and rabbinic interpretation of the law rather than the plain law itself. In that you can see from the moment of his birth to the moment of his death how Christ was fully obedient to the Torah.
Yeah, then the next reason St. Thomas gives here is in order by his example to exhort us to be obedient, wherefore he was circumcised on the 8th day according to the prescription of the law. And so we see here the lesson, is one of the objections Thomas deals with, is if we're supposed to follow the example of Christ in all things, and at the very least Gentile Christians weren't supposed to be circumcised, why would Christ do it if we're not supposed to follow his example in that? But the reasoning Thomas gives is, no, his example is to be obedient to God's law. And what it means to be obedient might look different to different people in different contexts, but it's the same principle, right? So someone who is a parent is going to have a very different set of duties than someone who isn't a parent, but that doesn't mean they have a different set of morals they're supposed to follow. It's that they have different contexts in which they're applying those morals. And I think this is where a lot of Jews as well misunderstand Catholic ethics, because Jewish ethics is very sort of law-centric. It's what would be called in sort of in moral philosophy a deontological ethics. There's a set of laws God has given, and you're meant to follow those laws. Whereas Catholicism developed much more of a virtue ethics approach to morality that focuses much more on what is the purpose and the context of the acts. And the purpose of the law ultimately is to point us to those ends and to give us the proper context in which to perform that. So it doesn't mean that the law becomes unimportant. It becomes very important because it gives us the framework in which to reach that end. But that doesn't, but there's more of a focus on actually the ultimate purpose of the law rather than the law for its own sake. Versus in Judaism, there's often much more of a focus on the law itself.
Picture. Right. I think even, and when you don't have that light of Christ to kind of shine a spotlight on all the dark spots that you have in your theology, they just get darker and darker. And it's really easy to get derailed and focus on the wrong thing if you don't have the guidance of the Holy Spirit that way.
Yeah. I was reading an article from Alan Brill, who's a Jewish scholar, but very involved in dialogue with Catholics. And he was responding to some essays by some Catholics on the purpose of the Torah. And he was sort of objecting that the Catholic tradition tends to be very focused on how the purpose of the law was to point to Christ. And his objection says, no, the purpose of the law is not to foreshadow. And then he goes through, well, what is the purpose of it in the Jewish tradition? And he sort of gives 4 reasons he finds in the Jewish tradition, which is from Saadia Gaon. He points out this: it makes the Jews a community, and it is ultimately for reward and punishment in the afterlife. Then he goes to Maimonides, and he says the purpose is that it helps you live a good life. Then he goes to sort of Kabbalistic thinkers who it's about mystical communion with God. And he says, see, so the Jewish tradition, there's many different reasons that are given in different authors. They don't all agree, but none of them say it's to foreshadow the Messiah. But what I would say to that, I think, is if they can't all agree on what the purpose of the law is, what's the harm in sort of adding one additional reason that it could be? Because we all agree it's to form the Jews as a people. When St. Thomas is discussing the law, he gives 2 reasons for the law. He says the first one is in the literal sense, that it's a good law to live by. So, for example, we see idolatry was very rampant in the ancient world. So it was good for God to give a set of rituals for the Jews to worship by so that they would practice proper worship instead of idolatrous worship. But it also has this other reason of foreshadowing the work that the Messiah would come and do. And so Thomas, he doesn't deny the literal sense that the Jews can also hold, that it forms the Jews as a community, that it helps them live a good life. But it adds on this other mystical meaning. And the Jews then develop their own different mystical meanings in the Kabbalistic tradition. And so I think what we're saying here is, no, actually, we just disagree with you on what the symbolic meaning of it is, but we can both agree on the literal meaning. And actually, St. Thomas actually draws a lot on the work of Maimonides when he talking about the literal sense. And he actually draws heavily, because when the works of Maimonides were entered into the West, a lot of Catholics started denying the spiritual senses. They said, oh, Maimonides figured out it's all literal. And St. Thomas says, no, we can affirm all the good literal stuff that Maimonides helps to bring here, but also we can uphold our traditional mystical understanding of it. And the Jewish tradition does the same thing, that a lot of Jews early on, they actually hand Maimonides' works over to the Catholic authorities to burn, because they say this is heretical. It's all focused on the literal sense, and it's missing the deeper mystical meanings in Judaism that Judaism sort of turns and focuses on in the Zohar and other Kabbalistic works. And so Judaism and Christianity, later Judaism will heavily receive Maimonides' works as a really good explanation of the literal sense of the law. And I think both Judaism and Christianity see the great genius in Maimonides focusing on the literal sense of bringing in all of this, while also saying we need to understand the spiritual sense as well, because without the spiritual sense, our religion sort of loses its soul and its ultimate meaning.
Right. And I think, if you think about the blessing that you say upon performing different commandments, you refer to God sanctifying the nation of Israel through the commandments. So there is this baseline understanding that whatever practical or literal beneficial benefits or reasoning there is for different mitzvot, different commandments, it was generally a tool to sanctify the nation of Israel, which I think begs the question, sanctify them towards what? I mean, sure, salvation on a personal level, being close to God and showing a love and appreciation towards Him, which I don't think any Jew or Christian would argue against. But if this is a process that the entire nation is going through, what's the end goal of it? And I think Jews, by and large, would say, Geulah, the redemption of the world. To which we would say, yeah, that's absolutely right. We just disagree on the finer details, so to speak.
Exactly. The next reason St. Thomas gives here is, quote, that he who had come in the likeness of sinful flesh might not reject the remedy whereby sinful flesh was wont to be healed. So he's showing that, you put the quote here from, I think it's St. Gregory of Nyssa, where he talks about what is not assumed is not healed. That Christ had to take on everything that was going to be redeemed, and so he takes on our whole human life. There's a really good discussion on this as well from St. Maximus the Confessor, really, I think, heavily drawing on Pope St. Leo the Great, which is this idea of the communication of idioms. That God, in his divinity, unites himself with humanity in the incarnation. And so every human work that Christ does, it's also God doing that work. And so there's a union of humanity and divinity in that act. And so divinity is flowing through all the acts. In a sense here, we could even say in circumcision, that it is God who is here, the one being circumcised as well, through the communication of idioms. We should probably, I think, do some shows on explaining the Trinity and the Incarnations. I know we're scandalizing any Jewish listeners here with sort of this phrasing of things. But I think once you understand what we're actually saying by that, it's this very profound idea, but is not at all diminishing the transcendence of God, which I think is what Jews are worried we're doing, is that we're diminishing the transcendence of God, but we're really not at all.
Right.
But we're saying God communicates himself fully to us, which I ultimately think is at the core of Judaism as well, which is that it's about God coming to dwell with us. And in Christianity, we say God actually dwells with us in the highest degree by uniting himself to human nature and living the perfect human life in one sense, but also the perfect Jewish life that God has of any of the different cultures of the world that he could have chosen to come and live his life among. It's specifically the Jewish life that he comes to live his life among and communicate himself to.
Right. And I would say thereby sanctify, there's, because as you say, St. Thomas talks about a lot about how Christ didn't really have to do anything a certain way, but it was befitting that he would, and then why it was best that he did it this way out of all the other options. So he could have made it such that the law would be completely done away with, the church would be completely founded upon his birth, and then he wouldn't be circumcised, he wouldn't be obedient to the law. But he thought it's a strange way to put it, but he thought it best to live his entire life as an obedient Jew, and then thereby not only taking upon himself the burden of the law, but also sanctifying the law to a much, much higher extent than it ever reached when it was observed by, mere humans, mere creatures who always fall short of the divine requirement.
Absolutely. And we see this even in eternity, in a sense, because we see in the book of Hebrews that Jesus, at his ascension, he ascends into the heavenly Holy of Holies. And this is actually an idea in the Jewish tradition as well. There's a heavenly temple as well. And that the prior temples did not fully bring God's presence into the world. And there's actually an idea that the third temple will directly descend from heaven and not be built by human hands. There's a big debate about this in the Jewish tradition. Other people think it will be built by human hands. But there's a tradition it will descend directly from heaven because it will be the perfect temple. And that's sort of what we have as well, that the third temple is Christ's ascension into heaven, into the heavenly Holy of Holies, that in his return he will bring down to earth and unite heaven and earth. And the church is this foretaste of the temple brought down to earth. And that in the Mass, the priest unites himself to the heavenly temple and brings down the heavenly temple to earth and brings us up to the heavenly temple.
Right.
The last reason St. Thomas brings here is he says, quote, that by taking on himself the burden of the law, he might set others free therefrom, according to Galatians 4:4-5. God sent his Son, made under the law, that he might redeem those who were under the law. I think at some point it'd be good for us to sort of go through Galatians in more depth, because this is, I think, one of the more controversial letters of Paul in its proper understandings. It's been debated a lot in the tradition. Is this just about Gentiles, or is this about Jews as well?
Right.
In some Jews hold that Jesus perhaps came as a Gentile Messiah, right? So this is the view of Pinchas Lapid. Hopefully I pronounced his name correctly there. He was a rabbi in the 20th century who wrote a book called The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective, where he actually admits that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is really, really strong. And he says clearly it brought about Christianity, that thereby brought the knowledge of God to the Gentiles. And so he's willing to say perhaps God actually did raise Jesus from the dead to bring the knowledge of God to the Gentiles, but he's ultimately not the Jewish Messiah because he doesn't fulfill our Jewish expectations of what the Messiah should do. But I think we see here is that Jesus living his life as a Jew, bringing himself under the law, he's actually first and foremost the Messiah to the Jews. And so we can't, for, say, politically correct reasons, say, therefore, Jews can sort of do their own thing, Christians can do their own thing. And this is, I think, the other important purpose of Hebrew Catholics, is we help other Catholics ground themselves more fully in the Old Testament by bringing a living witness to that tradition. But we also bring to Jews a living witness of what the fulfillment of their own tradition looks like, in a way they can see, that actually know, in the Jewish mind, right, Christianity is an acceptable religion for Gentiles, at least in the eyes of many Jews. And we can say, no, but it's also the religion for Jews as well. It's not merely the religion for Gentiles. There's one additional interesting reason that comes up when I was reading Guéranger, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote about the liturgy, is when he's discussing the Feast of the Circumcision. He brings up an interesting point that this is actually the first shedding of the blood of Christ. And there's a point where St. Thomas Aquinas mentions how actually a single drop of the blood of Christ on its own would have been sufficient to redeem us. So first of all, God could have just redeemed us without the whole work of Christ, but he felt it fitting to do it through the work of Christ. But actually a single drop of Christ's blood, because it's of infinite value, could have been enough to actually fittingly atone for all our sins. And so actually at this moment of the circumcision, God could have at that moment used that drop of the blood of Christ to redeem us from all of our sins. And so in a sense, this is actually the beginning of Christ's passion and redemption through his suffering and shedding of his blood for us.
Right, and if you think about it, I think it really corresponds nicely to the Passion because it's an act of obedience, it involves suffering, it involves the shedding of blood. A lot of the elements that we view as kind of focal to the Passion of Christ and his crucifixion are already present here in his circumcision. And I think this reason alone is enough to merit us making a bigger deal out of the circumcision of Christ than we tend to today in the West. The first shedding of Christ's blood, when we think about how we treat the blood of Christ in the sacraments, for example, the sanctity, the awe that, how much we try to respect it, we don't view it as something to be taken lightly at all. And this is the first time Christ agreed for his blood to be shed. Really, I think this should be a bigger focal point, if not in the liturgical calendar, then at least privately, devotionally, for Catholics individually.
Yeah, absolutely. One last point here then from St. Thomas Aquinas is he brings up the circumcision of Christ again in question 40, Article 4, where he's discussing the life of Christ. He basically asks, was it fitting for Christ to conform his entire life to the law? And he answers that, quote, Christ conformed his conduct in all things to the precepts of the law. In token of this, he wished to be circumcised, for circumcision is a kind of protestation of a man's purpose of keeping the law. According to Galatians 5:3, I testify every man circumcising himself that he is a debtor to do the whole law. I think this is really important in refuting the accusation again, as you were mentioning many times earlier, that Christ was not a faithful Jew. And for St. Thomas, the circumcision is the proof that Christ also in the rest of his life conformed himself to the law and actually lived his life as a faithful Jew in all things.
Right. I mean, you could say that he didn't live out the law exactly the way Orthodox Jews do today. You can argue about what's the proper way to interpret or exercise some of these commandments. But if you look at Galatians 5:3 and you apply it kind of retroactively to Christ, I mean, Christ was circumcised by somebody else, but he's the only baby ever, you could say, that circumcised himself because he agreed to be circumcised before his incarnation. So he took it upon himself, thereby taking upon himself the entirety of the law, and kind of, again, ruining this argument that he wasn't Torah observant, that he wasn't a good Jew, just completely destroying it.
Yeah. So I thought maybe we could turn from here then to discussing circumcision within the Christian tradition. This is where it shifts from perhaps a more positive portrayal of circumcision to what sometimes could be a much more negative understanding of circumcision. Because there's this line in Galatians where it mentions that St. Paul says, if you are circumcised, Christ profits you nothing. And this is quoted sometimes even against Jewish Christians keeping any sort of Jewish tradition, especially keeping circumcision. But I do think it's important in its original context to realize that I think this is much more clearly about Gentiles being circumcised. And I think there's some very clear evidence for this in the New Testament itself. In Acts, I think it's 16, St. Paul circumcises Timothy. But even more importantly, actually, I think is Acts 21. St. Paul visits Jerusalem. And when he visits Jerusalem, St. James comes up to him and says, basically, yes, the Jewish Christians here are very happy that you've brought God to the Gentiles. This is great. But St. James says here, he says, quote, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. And they have told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs. It's very interesting here that one of the accusations made at Paul is that he tells Jewish Christians in the diaspora not to circumcise their children. And then Paul, as to prove that he's not doing this, he goes into the temple and offers a sacrifice. And it's actually very interesting that he offers a sacrifice for the purification of a Nazirite vow, which is a temporary vow you could take in the Old Testament. But he actually takes the Nazirite vow back in Acts 19 when he's still traveling. Because some people will say, oh, he just offers a sacrifice as sort of a way to get these people off his back. But he's actually doing the purification for a Jewish ritual he had already started 2 chapters earlier.
Yeah.
And so I think this makes it a little bit complicated if we want to say that he was just doing this to sort of get some people off his back here. And I think we can actually understand that in Galatians, the whole point of Galatians, right, is about who is a member of the covenant. And I think it actually has a lot to do with the whole question of table fellowship, right, when Paul confronts Peter and so on. And it's very likely, I think, we know in the early church that actually the Eucharist would be received not at the Mass itself, but actually at a meal that would be had after the Mass. And so there's an issue if there's no table fellowship, then how can you be communing together? And the Eucharist, right, it is the new Passover. And in the old Passover, you could not receive the Passover unless you were circumcised. There's many actually rites of the Old Testament you could do, even as a Gentile. You could actually go and offer sacrifices at the temple. There was a whole courtyard for the Gentiles to go pray in. But there were certain things you could not do, and one of those things was the Passover. And so I think the point that Paul is making is that, you are a child of Abraham. You can participate in the Passover if you're a Gentile by baptism, because you've been incorporated into Christ. And if you're requiring circumcision, then you're denying the whole sacramental system, and by that you're denying Christ ultimately.
I think the argument that Paul was trying to get people off his back is weak, because we need to remember who it is that we're talking about. It's Paul and it's St. James. These are not 2 randos. These are spiritual giants who talk to the Lord in one way or another. And St. James, of course, being a brother or cousin of Jesus, was taught by him for quite a long time. If we wouldn't say it's permissible today to do something that denies the Catholic faith in order to get people off your back, then we shouldn't think it was permissible then. If it's an act of apostasy, it's an act of apostasy.
Yeah.
So we can talk about the theology behind it and why, but obviously making that sacrifice wasn't an act of apostasy to St. James or to St. Paul, and the act of circumcision wasn't an act of apostasy to either of them and to St. Timothy. So you're right, I think there's a lot more nuance here. Again, people in the Western world, at least, I think, Gentile Christians, I think I can say, tend to kind of view it as, the Old Testament came, and then Christ came, break, completely new lifestyle, from the off. And it's really important to know that it wasn't quite the case. There was kind of this intermittent period where what Paul is teaching here is that he's not saying to Jewish Christians, you need to stop circumcising your kids, but he's saying to Gentile Christians, you should not be circumcising your kids. You should not be submitting yourselves to the law. But he's not saying that to the Jewish Christians. We can talk at a later episode about what it all means. But I think that's an important distinction to really understand what's happening in these few chapters in Acts.
Yeah, there's actually a debate about this passage between St. Jerome and St. Augustine in the early church.
Right.
And St. Jerome basically wants to say that at Pentecost, the whole Torah ceased at that moment. And so you have the issue of, it's clear in the book of Acts that they are keeping many rituals. St. Jerome basically says that actually they just pretended to keep the law, sort of to get people off their backs. St. Augustine's response to this is, no, they would actually be committing grave sins by sort of pretending to do these things. Yeah. And actually it's very serious and important that they did keep them. But then Jerome replies with the objection that there's this group out there called the Nazarenes. So there are the Ebionites who were heretical Jewish Christians. There's this other group called the Nazarenes that actually agreed with us on our theology and other things. But it seems by this time, some sort of schism had arisen. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of sources on it, so we don't really know the details, and we're piecing together little things. But Jerome had spent a while living in the land of Israel, and so he had known about these. He went and actually learned Hebrew from rabbis. And so he had learned about these people and mentions them to Augustine. He says, we would all agree that converts from Judaism now should not keep it. And so Augustine sort of comes up with this periodization where there's the time before Christ where they were obligated to keep the law. Then the time once Christ comes where now they're allowed to keep the law, but it's not required. And then ultimately he says at some time, we're not certain, but clearly before now, it had fallen away. And so as a result of it falling away, it must have been in God's providence, sort of, that this is not supposed to be kept permanently, and so now converts from Judaism are not meant to keep it. And this is the tradition that sort of continues, and even possibly gets taken up magisterially at the Council of Florence. Yeah, but then there are some nuances to this that I think we should get into as well here, and I think we need to, in the future, go in much more detail on these questions. But there's a discussion of this in the papal encyclical Ex Quo by Benedict XIV. This is in the 1700s, where there's many customs in the Latin Church that clearly come from the Old Testament that were leading Greek Christians to say that Latin Christians were Judaizers. And likewise, there's many traditions among the Greek Christians that looked like Judaizing to Latin Christians. And actually, I think even to Latin Christians today would look like it, such as the forbidding of certain foods from the old law, as well as actually keeping purification rituals. So it'll be very common, for example, for women in the Byzantine Rite to stay home for 40 days after childbirth, and then to bring the child in and sort of do a rite of purification, which to Latin Christians would sort of be very scandalizing, I think, in certain ways. And so what Benedict XIV basically says is that when certain customs from the old law are taken up and practiced within the context of the rites of the church, they actually could not be said to be Judaizing, because what they are now is rites of the church. And we can actually see the close continuity then between actually the old law and the rites of the church. And then, but he does say there's sort of two things he says not to bring in. And he cites Vasquez on this. And I followed up in Vasquez, and Vasquez just repeats what Benedict says, so he doesn't, I wasn't able to get a reasoning in Vasquez, unfortunately, but he says circumcision, animal sacrifice. He lists as the two things not to repeat. I think animal sacrifices is quite clear that we can all agree that the Eucharist replaces the animal sacrifices and that there's no more animal sacrifices.
Yeah, and whether or not it's permissible, that certainly is superseded by the sacrifice of Christ.
There's a good article by Pope Benedict XVI in his retirement on discussing this whole question of supersessionism. And he basically says, no, the church did not replace Israel. And he actually points out the church never taught that the church replaced the Jews. It's a very interesting comment. But then when he goes through specific topics, he does say in this one area, there actually is a supersession of the Eucharist superseding the animal sacrifices. But for circumcision, it is interesting that even in Thomas Aquinas, when he discusses it, he says it would be fine to do it like something for medical reasons, which is quite common in like America today. So it's not like if you circumcise your child for medical reasons, that's an act of apostasy. But I think part of the issue with the religious aspect is that it was so closely linked to doing the same things that baptism now does, of incorporating someone into the covenant and bringing them grace and so on, that this seemed very problematic from the eyes of the church. But it is practiced culturally, actually, among some Christian groups. So among Filipino Catholics, for example, it's very common. And you were mentioning that actually still Ethiopian Catholics and others will keep it.
Right, exactly. And I mean, in some of these Alexandrian churches, anybody who knows better than me, feel free to let us know in the comments. But from what I know, all the Alexandrian churches practice purity laws as well, which is what Ex Quo is actually talking about. So you'll have a son being circumcised, and then the mother won't show up for church for 40 days until there's a feast of the presentation of the child. And then the mom, after this period of purification, returns to the temple. So a lot of these things, and these are all firmly apostolic churches. I mean, Ethiopia is one of the first Christian nations. It was understood, at least here in my neighborhood, that some of these things can be kept within Christianity, and even if they're done in exactly the same way, their meaning maybe not changes, but kind of enhances, if that makes sense. And the rituals themselves are baptized, and they're being made into Christian rituals.
Yeah. I think this is why, to me, this is sort of an open question that I think hopefully in the future, I think the magisterium should come in and give further guidance on it. Because I feel like this is one of the things we often struggle with as Hebrew Catholics, is that the magisterium, I know from people who've actually spoken with past popes and stuff on this, that they were actually encouraging of it. I know of people who've spoken with John Paul II, Benedict, and Pope Francis. And then as well, the Hebrew Catholics have been approved of by Cardinal Burke and Cardinal Pizzaballa, who are by no means liberals. I mean, you've spoken yourself with Cardinal Pizzaballa about this. These are two of the most traditional bishops in the church today, I think, in many ways, who are approving of us. So, but I think it would be helpful if we had more clear magisterial guidance on some of these sorts of questions, because these are things that very practically affect people's sort of daily spiritual lives and choices they're going to make with their children. So I would like that. But sort of, perhaps if I were to give a reason that it might be done now, is that baptism, right, joins you to a supernatural society. That it joins you to the church. It's a strictly supernatural society. And it actually does not remove the natural societies that you're already part of. So when a Frenchman is baptized, he doesn't become any less French. A Chinese person, he doesn't suddenly become French just because the French are Catholics. He still remains Chinese. But that's not how Jews understand conversion. That when someone is circumcised as a convert to Judaism, it's almost like you're switching citizenships, right? So in some countries, you can become a citizen, just be a dual citizen. But there's other countries where if you want to become a citizen, you better renounce your old allegiances to your old countries. And that's in many ways how Jews understand conversion. Now, at least in the Old Testament, we can discuss whether or not it's the case now. At the very least back then, there was, at least in some sense, in becoming a member of the people of Israel, you were also uniting yourself to a supernatural society. You were uniting yourself to the church in hope of Christ's coming. So circumcision had two purposes, basically, to make you part of the natural society of the people of Israel and the supernatural society of the church. And so there could still be a question then of it uniting you still to this natural society of the people of Israel. That to me, it's a very open question. I understand why people would make decisions both ways, given sort of, I think, a certain unclarity from the magisterium on some of these questions right now.
Yeah, it's definitely a weighty matter, and it's not made any lighter by the fact that we have to make the decision ourselves. And it's really easy to feel ill-equipped to make such a theological decision alone. I agree that it would be very beneficial to see. It doesn't even have to be like a ruling. It could just be maybe another encyclical or something, or another kind of magisterial document that sheds a little bit more light, gives us a little bit more clarity on how to think about this. Because like you say, there are a lot of reasons to circumcise your sons if you are born into the nation of Israel that do not involve obedience to the entirety of the law, and do not involve partaking in hopes that are unchristian for a future Messiah to come or anything like that. There's just a sign of belonging to the nation of Israel and doing something that our ancestors have been doing for many thousands of years. I would like to see a little bit more clarity on that as well.
Yeah. No, because I also understand very much, right? Someone saying there's all these things against it, and we're heavily basing our existence magisterially on using ex quo, and the ex quo says, but don't do this one thing. There could also be good reasons to follow that. So that's where I think, to me, this is very open. But I think this leads us well then into discussing what our larger project is with this podcast, as well as your work with the Association of Hebrew Catholics.
Right.
We see in the early church, there was this Jewish church that was very clearly present there that sort of fell away for reasons that are not entirely clear, I think, as you look at the historical record, but clearly by the 4th century at the latest was not really present in the church, and probably by the 5th century did not exist anywhere. But if you look at the church fathers, it's very interesting that they're all consistent on the ultimate redemption of the people of Israel according to the flesh, of the Jews. And this is a lot of people in reacting to, say, Protestant dispensationalism in Catholic circles today are denying this. But this is universal among our sources. Like, this is not dispensationalism. I feel like some people sort of throw around the word dispensationalism to mean anything that has Jews having any theologically ongoing meaning. As though Catholics aren't dispensationalists, therefore we don't believe. And then it'll be all sorts of things that are traditionally believed about the Jews still being important in salvation history. But you look at, I mean, St. John Chrysostom, right? He delivers these sermons against the Jews that maybe we could discuss in a future podcast that are very harsh against the Jews. But you look at his commentaries on Matthew 23 or Romans 11, and he's still discussing the ultimate future redemption of the Jews. Like, this is something that's absolutely universal among the fathers when you look about this. There's now this modern ecclesial interpretation of all Israel will be saved. And there are people who talk about this as meaning the church, but then they'll always clarify it means the Jews as united to the church. Because I don't have any issue with saying all Israel includes the Gentiles as spiritually united to Israel. But it also includes the Jews. And I think the tradition is very clear about this. And so if we're going to say that the Jews are going to be redeemed, and I think the church has also developed a very strong theology of enculturation, that the liturgy, Americans especially, I think, tend to be very individualistic. Like, the way we treat liturgical rites here is like, which, like, fast food restaurant do you want to go to? Like, oh, I'll go to a Byzantine rite this week because I like it. I'll go to a Latin rite. I'm completely guilty of this, to be clear. I'm technically Byzantine rite. I mainly go to a Novus Ordo. I got married at the Latin Mass. I keep, like, Hebrew Catholic traditions at home. So, like, I'm 100% guilty of this, like, pick and choose American individualism. But it's very deeply ingrained in American culture. And then Americans run the online discourse most of the time because we sort of run the world. And so, because of that, I think that we often miss that actually the church has developed this very rich theology of the role of nations in the enculturation of liturgy to nations. And this is actually part of the liturgical reforms that were supposed to happen at Vatican II. So if you read Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is sort of how the church imagined the liturgical reform was going to look, it looks nothing like it actually turned out to be in many ways. Yeah. But one of the things it's talking about is that in mission lands, the church should actually be enculturated. And this was actually the case, even in medieval Europe. If you went to different medieval European lands, the Mass would have looked different in different countries. There was different rites like the Sarum rite or the Mozarabic rite or other things. Yeah, that in reaction to Protestantism, the Protestants were now just sort of making up everything. The church was like, all right, you can only use a liturgy so that the Roman rite we're promulgating or any liturgy that's at least 200 years old. Like, this is not, it does not make everyone use the Roman rite. But sort of the memo everyone got is, let's just use the Roman rite. So except for stuff like the Dominican rite, pretty much everyone just adopted the way the Mass would be celebrated in Rome. And so as a result, unfortunately, in Latin Catholic consciousness, we started to think the liturgy should look the same in every place, but that's not actually how the church historically understood it. The reason Latin was used everywhere in the West is because anyone who was educated knew Latin. This was the common language of people at the time. And then we sort of doubled down on it in many ways in reaction to Protestantism. But I think that at Vatican II, one of the good things to come out of Vatican II was a better awareness of enculturation. And some of our best missionary work, actually, even between Trent and Vatican II, was done with enculturation. So, for example, in China, there was the development of what were being called the Chinese rites, which was sort of using traditional Chinese vestments and trying to make Catholicism look Chinese. That was actually very appealing and very successful in evangelizing in China. And then rumors about it were spread back to the Pope that led to its temporary suppression that actually killed missionary work in China in many ways. Like, the emperor almost converted to Catholicism in China. Another good example of this,
it's a tragic story,
is in Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia actually almost became Catholic. In the 1600s, the king of Ethiopia wanted to become Catholic. And initially, the church was like, oh, of course you can keep your liturgical rites. But Ethiopia actually traditionally never had their own bishop. They would get bishops from Egypt. So now they were becoming Catholic. They needed a new bishop. So the Portuguese sent a bishop over. And this Portuguese tried to make them all Latin. And that actually led to a big backlash. And this is a big reason Ethiopia today remains among the Oriental Orthodox who did not become Catholic. And so when we don't enculturate the liturgy, what we're fundamentally saying, actually, is we're doing in many ways like what the Judaizers were doing originally, that no, in order to become Christian, you have to give up your culture and join the culture that most of the Christians were, which in that day was Jews. And I think in many ways people are saying similar things, that you should give up all your cultural customs. One of the critiques we'll often get is from these people who actually care very deeply about preserving their European heritage. And I think actually in many ways, they're right to be concerned about the preservation of their European heritage. And what we're saying is that's great that you guys want to preserve your heritage. We want to preserve our heritage in many ways. And look at how grace perfects nature. That actually, just as you guys see, right, in keeping your tradition of being French or German or English or whatever, you actually see Catholicism as fulfilling that identity for you. We in many ways see the same thing in our own Jewish identity. That there's this phrase in the tradition of grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. Of everything that's good in our human nature was created by God so that Christ could redeem it and perfect it.
Exactly. I think it also shows, like you said earlier today, people tend to kind of to say that we are overly obsessive with our national identity or with our ethnic identity or with our heritage. And all the examples that you show, and there are many more. If you look at some of the Syriac rites, East Syriac rites, and the interactions they had actually also with the Portuguese, you can see that a lot of nations, whether or not they were Christian at that point, gave the church a lot of pushback when the church tried to dilute or assimilate their culture. And nations responded well when enculturation happened. And if you look, for example, at the Eastern churches, Arabic has been a liturgical rite in the Middle East since the 10th century. That's very shortly after the Arab conquests of the Levant. Essentially, as soon as they realized, this is the common language, they translated the liturgy and they started praying in that language. So like you said earlier, all we want really is, we don't want to be considered as superior, and we don't want anything that any other nation has not received. But we want to be treated the same way other nations have been treated, and have the faith enculturated as well. And I think that your point about, you talked in the beginning about kind of pushing back against dispensationalism. I think, and I understand why people freak out about dual covenant theology and everything else, but it's also important to remember that when you defend against these things as a Catholic, what you're leaning up against is 2,000 years of very robust theological and intellectual tradition. You don't need to be hysterical about this. And Catholicism always moves forward in a very sure-footed way. So throwing out the baby with the bathwater is not historically the Catholic solution. Historically, the Catholic solution is to point out what's right in the different positions and then end up with, the correct point of view on this matter, even if it ends up being what looks like an amalgamation of two or more different sides. We don't need to be afraid of that happening.
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we adopt the language of the debates that are going on in the Protestant world, we end up conforming ourselves to categories that aren't Catholic at all, right? So in reaction to dispensationalism, a lot of people say we're going to adopt like covenant theology and preterism and stuff. Well, these are all ideas that actually come from Calvinism and sometimes adopted by Catholics in reaction to dispensationalism. And a point a friend of mine made is that when we use these words, it makes it sound like we're having the same discussion as them, and we're actually not oftentimes having the same discussion. Like we're having our own discussion. We have our own theology. I feel like the same way with supersessionism. And I think this is the point Benedict was trying to make in his 2018 article, as he said, like, when I go back to old theological dictionaries, I can't find a word in here that says a theory of substitution. Like, these are not words that are being used. And so we need to return to what does our tradition actually say? And then how does that apply in our current context?
Right, and that's not to say we shouldn't partake in the discussion about these theological issues. It's just that we shouldn't surrender the Catholic tradition and Catholic modes of thinking just in order to partake. It's okay to take these discussions and kind of reframe them within the Catholic intellectual tradition in order to think about them in a Catholic way.
Yeah. You see this always with St. Thomas Aquinas, is that almost always his objections aren't completely wrong. Like, he'll list objections before he gives the answers, but he almost never has an objection that's entirely wrong. There's usually some aspect of truth in it. And I feel like this is a lot of the times with the debates, but there are lots of biblical verses that just don't make sense unless they still in some sense apply to Jews even today. And dispensationalists will jump on that, and some people will push back against that, not realizing that oftentimes our own tradition will still take these as about Jews today, like the all Israel will be saved, as an example, or the idea there's verses in Jeremiah about how the people of Israel will never cease from the face of the earth. And people say, oh, that's about the church now. Well, yes, spiritually it's about the church, but like St. Augustine discusses how this is still literally about the Jews as well, that they actually play a role as a witness people that will be preserved until the end of time.
Right, and even the connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel, which I'm not merely saying that the Catholic tradition is universally Zionistic in any way, but you can see this relationship between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. It does come back in quite a few very prominent writers. Some see it after the mass conversion. You know, there are different, they place it in different places, but you can see that they still all thought that there's this connection between the physical land of Israel and the physical people of Israel. So we shouldn't be afraid to talk in these terms, even if the current discussion isn't predominantly Catholic.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that also now I think there's a political discussion poisoning a lot of these things as well, that people are often concerned about where you're going to land politically on these issues. So, for example, with the question of the land of Israel, and I think we should do some future podcasts and it would be interesting. But there are groups out there, for example, of Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionist. And some people will latch onto this and say, see, Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism. But those religious Jews, they still think one day all the Jews will return to the land of Israel. To them, it's still a holy land. To them, the issue with Zionism oftentimes is that the land is so holy, how dare these secular Jews come along and start doing things on their own? God is supposed to do this work through the Messiah. And
right,
so,
it's not about the what, it's about the when and the how.
Yeah, and so I think in that discussion then, we can say, all right, there's a connection between the land of Israel and the people of Israel, while remaining open questions on Zionism. I think this is actually where the church has gotten, that the church has talked about in magisterial statements the connection between the land of Israel and the people of Israel, while at the same time not being afraid to make critical statements of the state of Israel at times, or taking quite a while to recognize the state. Because of that distinction you can draw there, I think. And we'd have to get into other podcasts to get more into this.
Yeah, it's a big subject, but I think these are all points kind of worth pondering.
Yeah, and maybe one last point I wanted to point out here is that some people will say, because the church is not of this world, we shouldn't be so attached to our earthly identities. And that's true in a sense, but we ultimately need to realize our true citizenship is in heaven, and we often have to give up earthly things. But it's interesting that when Lumen Gentium, which is the primary document of Vatican II, discusses how the kingdom of God is not of this world, actually sees that it's not at all opposed to national identities. This is in section 13. It says, quote, "Since the kingdom of Christ is not of this world, the church of the people of God, in establishing that kingdom, takes away nothing from the temporal welfare of any people. On the contrary, it fosters and takes to itself, insofar as they are good, the ability, riches, and customs in which the genius of any people expresses itself. Taking them to itself, it purifies, strengthens, elevates, and ennobles them. The church in this is mindful that she must bring together the nations for that king to whom they are given as an inheritance, and to whose city they bring gifts and offerings. This characteristic universality which adorns the people of God is a gift from the Lord himself. By reason of it, the Catholic Church constantly strives, and with due effect, to bring all humanity and all its possessions back to its source in Christ, with him as its head and united in his spirit." So there's a diversity of gifts that God gives to the different people of this world. So it's not as though, as well, in recognizing the goodness of each nation, we're saying like someone should be racist towards other nations or anything, but rather we should recognize that just as different people are given different gifts, different nations are given different gifts as well that they can bring to the church. And ultimately, God has created the diversity of nations in this world, so that way they can come under Christ, who is the King of Kings. So his kingship doesn't take away from the kingship of some king over a nation, but rather it actually elevates their kingship to a supernatural purpose. We see this in the book of Revelation, where all the kings of the earth bring the glory of their nations into the New Jerusalem. That grace, it perfects nature and it elevates nature, that it brings nature beyond what it is and ultimately to its true purpose in the divine economy.
Right, and I think when you think about that, it ties back to a point you mentioned earlier. The Franks were welcome into the church qua Franks, and the Germanics qua Germanics. Their Frenchness and their Germanness and their Englishness is not diminished. And the English are actually a perfect example of this, because a lot of people view Englishness as fundamentally opposed to Catholicism. But in reality, Catholicism perfects Englishness. It doesn't diminish it one bit. And it's actually the ancient tradition of the English people. And in the same way, Father Levy talks about the church needs, about how the church needs to accept Israel into itself qua Israel. So not kind of culturally converting them. And if Englishness and Germanness and Frenchness are perfected and enhanced and brought to the fullest version of themselves within the Catholic framework, then Israeliness, Jewishness, Hebrewness should undergo the same process. That it'll be the fullest version of itself within the Catholic Church, not outside of the Catholic Church. And I think this is a paradigm shift for both Jews and Christians.
Exactly. And I see our vocation as somewhat similar to, say, like the Eastern Catholic churches, right? Where some of the Eastern Catholic churches, they fully come over, like the Maronites, or even the majority have in some places, with other rites. But there's, I think, a dozen Russian Catholic parishes, like in the entire world.
I think there are like 5 or something.
Yeah, they're very, very few. But the purpose of them being Catholic is they're a living witness to Russia, which very much in its identity is Orthodox and not being in communion with Rome. There's a great tradition of Alexander Nevsky rejecting the cardinals who come to him to try to bring Russia into communion with Rome. And so a big part of Russia's identity is that they're not in communion with Rome. But by living out some of them, they're actually showing that nothing of Russian identity is lost by being in communion with Rome. And so they live it out as a prophetic calling. So even if most Jews aren't converting, I think what we're doing in living out the identity is being a prophetic witness to the rest of the Jewish people, that actually nothing of what's best in them as Jews has to be taken away for them to come into the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, the jury is kind of still out on what that looks like practically when your Jewishness is not diminished. I think it's worth mentioning that this sort of language of Catholicism being the fulfillment of Judaism, and fulfillment as opposed to making it obsolete or whatever, often it's used as a very thin veneer to talk about Judaism being obsolete and Jewish life being obsolete. So that's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is bringing authentic Jewish life, and authentic Jewish identity into the church, kind of baptizing it, and living it in the light of Christ. And the jury is still out on what that looks like as far as, church rulings are concerned. But like you said, being first fruits, we kind of had to live this out, let theologians play around a little bit and bring this to church authorities and kind of see what happens. Because there hasn't really, one of the reasons the church hasn't ruled on this, and even if you look at things like the Council of Florence, even when it talks specifically about circumcision, it doesn't talk about Jews, circumcising. It talks about Gentiles kind of bringing that custom back. And that's because there hasn't been a need. And since the Holocaust, there's been mass conversions. The number of Jewish Christians hasn't been this high since the 1st or 2nd century. And now the need arises to discuss these things and see how it's lived out.
I think especially in your context in Israel, I think that the way historically a lot of, pastorally it makes sense there, right? A Frenchman in the a Jew living in France becomes a Catholic. There's no way to have a Jewish Catholic community with a few Frenchmen who've converted, right? Or a few French Jews. Yeah. So it makes most sense. Let's just assimilate them among the larger French population. That's clearly the easiest thing to do. And that makes actually, I think, a lot of pastoral sense. But in a modern context, right, when I converted, I did not think much about my Jewishness for a long time. Because as an American, it's very easy for me to assimilate into the larger sort of Gentile American Catholic milieu. But you, in your context, you're there where the majority population is Jewish. And so there's a question of what do we do when assimilation isn't pastorally even a possibility there. And as well, there's also now tens of thousands of Messianic Jews in Israel. And in America, it's hard to get good numbers because so many Gentiles will attend these Messianic Jewish synagogues. But in Israel, they actually are primarily Jewish, so we actually have much better numbers. And I think in those tens of thousands, imagine if we could bring those back into communion with us, just like we have the Eastern Catholic churches to bring the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox and the Syrian Church of the East, or we have the Anglican Ordinariate to bring the Anglicans to us. I think this could actually be a good witness to Messianic Jews, that there already are a large body of Jews who believe in Jesus who want to keep up their cultural traditions. So can we point them in a way that can bring them into the church without them feeling like they're going to lose everything that they are?
Yeah, you're right. And I think the point about being an Israeli Catholic is really interesting because I lived in Austria for 3 years, and it's in a very meaningful ways impossible to partake in Austrian culture without partaking in Catholic culture, right? Because Austrian identity is just so rooted in the Catholic Church. So in a similar way, I don't believe there's any such thing as an Israeli identity that isn't fundamentally Jewish, because the liturgical calendar we live by here is Jewish. The days of the week, the feast, everything we do is kind of passively, the presupposition is that it's based on Jewish life and Jewish modes of thinking. So I don't think there's a way to be benignly Israeli without partaking in Jewish culture in some way. And this is the first time this is a situation since 134 AD. Mm-hmm. So the church doesn't really know in a lot of ways how to respond to this. How do you live as a Catholic within a Jewish society? We don't really have any information on that. So this is something that needs to be discussed on a few levels, both of when we're speaking about bringing Jewish life, prayer, tradition into the life of the church, into the life of Jewish or Hebrew Catholics, and also just these kind of everyday clashes on how do you live out your Christian identity when assimilation into the local culture entirely isn't really possible. How do you maintain practically these tensions?
Yeah, I think that's why it's great it's the two of us having these discussions on this podcast, because you're actually at the forefront in many ways of figuring out what this could look like practically, living there in Israel, now running the Association of Hebrew Catholics in Israel. And then you're also in communication there with many bishops in Israel, if you want to perhaps talk about that a little bit, about how, because I think a lot of people don't understand this is actually ecclesiastically supported, what we're doing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even though the Association of Hebrew Catholics is not an official organization within the church, as you said, Cardinal Burke is a supporter. Patriarch Pizzaballa, you can go on our website and see the permission he gave us. I met with him a couple of times. The Syriac Patriarchal Vicar, Bishop Mar Yaakov Ephraim here in Jerusalem is a supporter, and quite a few other bishops and cardinals. This is something that's happening within the church, and I think you're right to say that Israel, any Hebrew Catholic living here in Israel is kind of the forefront of this, because like I said, you can't be benignly Catholic. If you live here, you're a Hebrew Catholic to some extent, because your family does Passover and Hanukkah and everything else. And everybody does, work does, school does, everybody does. And in your side of things, being neck deep in the theological world and having a lot of friends who run in those circles, I think is the other side, me bringing the kind of the practical side of how that looks like, and you bringing in the theological bit.
Something I want to do with this podcast is to try to bring on some of the leading theologians working on these questions. There's a big disconnect between the world of academic Catholic theology and the world of popular online discourse. Because in a lot of the popular online discourse, we have people who are just sort of putting out their own opinions there. I'm guilty of this at times too. You sort of put out whatever your own thought is on it without any connection to I'm not talking about like liberal Catholic theologians or anything, but people who are very faithful to the church, who are actually seriously working on these sorts of questions, either doing research of the tradition or thinking about how it applies now. And I do think at times some of the academic discourse on it is a bit disjointed. And so one of the things I hope to do as well is, can we bring about a real synthesis of the tradition? Because there's sometimes a disconnect between people working on how the tradition has treated this, how we should treat it now in light of Vatican II or contemporary biblical scholarship. But I really do think there is a way to bring this all together. And I think this is actually what Pope Benedict was working on at the end of his life in his 2018 Communio article, where he was saying, actually, maybe we need to question the assumption everyone's working with here, which is that the church taught supersessionism up to Vatican II and then abandoned it at Vatican II. He's saying, no, the church has always understood the redemption of Israel. It's always understood that the Jews continue to play a role as this witness people, that they don't cease to be Jews. This is a common accusation. After the Talmud, the Jews are no longer the real Jews, or after the Khazars, they're no longer real Jews or whatever. But the church has always understood the Jewish people to be the continuation of the ancient Jewish people that we find in the Bible. That's the same nation. The church has always understood that. And so I think there actually is a way to bring about a synthesis of both the tradition and contemporary discourse. And I'm hoping in some of the interviews that I do on this podcast that we can see how everything fits together.
Yeah, and I think bringing the theological side into this is really important, because I've spoken to a few people who think this is a very grassroots thing that's happening, Hebrew Catholicism such as it is. And I've seen a lot of people who think that any bishop or any priest who finds this interesting is just kind of as a curiosity. And I think people underestimate the amount of theological prowess that sometimes is behind some of these movements, and how high up some of these theological processes actually go. So it'll be very interesting to hear you talking to these people here.
All right, well, unless you have anything else to add, I think that we got through our whole outline for today. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you everyone so much for listening, and please share our podcast with anyone you think might be interested. And make sure, if you're watching this on YouTube, to like and subscribe. And if you're watching this through a podcasting platform, to subscribe there. And thank you everyone for listening.
See you next time.
Shaddai יתגלה מהר סיני, דינך אמת ואמיתה, הוד ויקר היא מלכותך, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל. עלהו בו עמנואל, ופדה משבי ישראל, שמתייפח בגלותו, עד בן האל בא לפדותו, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל.